Thanks so much, Marina. That's great. I did have a PowerPoint, but I think actually it's easier just to talk. So please excuse me if it's not as fluent, because I was thinking I'd have the slides to aid me. But thank you, Justin. Thank you, Monsignor. It's an honor and a privilege to be here. So, you know, I think we've well established this morning that the issue of disinformation and the undermining of truth has always been with us, you know, concerned Aristotle. But we also know that, as Lee said earlier, the modern era that's particularly concerning us is much more recent in its genesis. And I think that's where kind of Marina's interest in human-computer interaction and the affordances of social media platforms and how this kind of thing is all interacting with these ancient problems is really important. And, you know, we see the effects around us. We've looked at the kind of the hyper-partisanship, and a lot of it is around our kind of awareness of scientific and uncertainty and so on. And I think it's important, like when we were looking at what Lee was saying earlier and what Steve was saying in result, it's actually a book I published with a colleague, Eileen College, earlier this year about disinformation and manipulation and digital media. I think it's important that we look at the kind of the process. So we see the bad actors, which is essentially the money that the Monsignor was talking about. We see the platforms, which is essentially the algorithms and how they're driving this, which I think Chris is doing some really useful experiments in. We're going to look at that. Then we need to think about the audiences, what's making people vulnerable. I'll reflect a little on that in order to get at the fourth bit, which I think is important, which is the countermeasures. So what are the countermeasures we can try to take about this? And for me, the one that I'm going to propose today, of course, it's no panacea, but, you know, is one about deliberation. So particularly deliberation within communities, large and small. So we can have deliberation in small communities. We can try to scale it up into bigger settings. But I think it's important before we kind of look at that is to look at spend just a minute on the kind of the link between post-truth and disinformation and scientific denial and skepticism. And I think, you know, if we look at the very beginning of the COVID crisis, or in the early days of the climate disaster, or indeed when we first started realizing about the evils of tobacco, the situation is very much aggravated when the scientific understanding isn't settled. Because scientists are not necessarily disagreeing with one another. Politicians are disagreeing with them about the source of us, and this can be weaponized against science. Now, one thing actually some colleagues of mine did, which I thought was interesting, was that the science of COVID was so much in the public domain and on the news channels that I actually think it's probably a reasonable hypothesis that scientific understanding will have increased over the course of the pandemic, with people realizing how science is built and how scientists go about their endeavors. But nonetheless, it gives bad actors, it gives the money the opportunity to weaponize against it. So we know we need to look to those bad actors. We need to look at the algorithms, but I think we need to look at what is it about the audiences? What is it about citizens, about the people, about the public, that these people are able and these algorithms are able to use against them? And I'm not a scholar of authoritarianism, and I've noticed a few people citing Hannah Arendt, but I did read some of the authoritarian literature over the last year and the last 18 months. And I think, it provides us with some really interesting clues, some really interesting kind of ways of going, because we know when we look at that literature that when people are faced with extreme economic, political, social crises, whether it's a pandemic, a terrorist act, whether it's some sort of climate disaster, then people tend to increasingly approve of authoritarian leaders, and they tend to increasingly want a more centralized way of governing because it makes them feel safer and makes them feel more protected. So they become more willing to trade off their democratic preferences and civil liberties in return for that safety and security. So I think we have to realize that and acknowledge that, And, think about that when we're thinking about how we're going to help communities. And I think a second problem that we as scientists probably don't acknowledge enough is the growing complexity of our modern societies and the kind of really specific scientific specialism. And I think it widens the kind of democratic legitimacy gap. There's a really interesting paper, Nebula and Wallace and APSR just last month, where they're arguing that the growing reliance of experts in policymaking kind of linked to this increasing technocracy really leads to challenges for democratic legitimacy. So we see governments all around the world becoming increasingly reliant on specialist expertise and decision-making. And a lot of the time it's precluded from any public scrutiny. And I think that's problematic, and that has major implications for public trust and for the trust in the legitimacy and the perceived legitimacy of the kind of policy measures. So I think that while there's a pressing need to identify ways to reduce science skepticism, we have to think about it, doing it in conjunction with enhancing democratic legitimacy. I think the two things must go together. So my appeal is that really any efforts that we make to try to correct post-truth, rather than simply appeal to expertise, scientists must also appeal to democratic values to restore public trust in science. So the question then for advocates of democracy is how to restore trust in reason, and indeed more prosaically, how to achieve general public acquiescence with necessary crisis mitigation measures democratically. So I think a lot of the research, we see different ways looking at, how governments were going to prompt large-scale public adherence to, to necessary COVID messages, for example. And, people looked at individual psychological interventions. We differently framed public appeals, empathetic appeals, invoking civic duty and so on. Michael Bang-Persson did amazing work in Denmark. You see what's happened in Denmark doing this kind of thing. And I think that kind of thing is amazing, generated really important insights. But I think we also need to focus and pursue interventions that are looking at greater, longer term impacts, which do so democratically. And for me, deliberation is one deliberative democracy, is one possible version of democracy that can help us perhaps reverse the decline in legitimacy. So, political theorists from Habermas on have been practitioners, long argued about deliberative democracy and the kind of solutions it can offer. I recently wrote a paper on the possibility of deliberative institutions in Northern Ireland in terms of its future constitutional position, but it's been used in many other ways. Ireland has had a long-running citizens' assembly or mini-public, but there's other types. There's citizens' juries run by Ned Crosby. There's the Oregon Citizens Initiative Review in Oregon. Jim Fishkin runs deliberative polls. There's all sorts of participatory budgeting across Latin America. There's lots of kind of community participative initiatives across Africa and across India. The Conference on the Future of Europe, which admittedly looks like it's going to be an absolute mess, is also looking at, using kind of deliberative and participative mechanisms. And the most important element of these is that they involve the random selection of lay citizens. So it's that random selection, people from different walks of life, people without necessarily having political interests. And then it's the competence they accrue by deliberating, by listening, by learning to others that allows them to instill trust in the wider community and in the wider public. So this is how Warren and Gastrell have talked about how they're trust agents. So they need to be high in competence, but low in kind of goal-motivated reasoning. So in other words, they need to be randomly selected and not there as representatives of any hyper-partisan divide for in some way. The other important thing is that these mini-publics or deliberative institutions can help us try to reduce the gap, I think, between citizens and experts. Because the mini-publics act in a deliberative way, they bring in experts, they bring in people on both sides, or they try to bring in neutral people. And therefore what they're listening to is reason and to expertise. And then they deliberate and talk among themselves in a facilitated manner. So therefore it's polite. It is not, you know, it's not a TV news debate kind of scenario in any way. And therefore the decisions are made on better information and more thorough consideration of arguments. Helen Landemore in Yale has made some fantastic, has done some fantastic work on that. So in this way, the argument is that these mini publics can act as trusted information proxies for citizens in the wider environment, and that these citizens might also conceive of them as sort of more enlightened versions of themselves. And of course, this builds on like the notion we all know that, you know, we, never mind ordinary citizens who've a million things to do to run their families and their lives, can't possibly engage in an in-depth manner on all the information they need and the kind of socio-political issues that they're affected by. So given the kind of complexity and the cognitive demands of that, so they have to bestow their trust on others. So the question is, who are they going to trust? And in this post-truth environment with the kind of weaponized social media, you know, the answer is too often the bad actors. So the thing is how to break that link and to bring it back into reason. Of course, we have to be worried. Christina Lafont has written a brilliant essay about, you know, blind deference to many publics, and of course, that is absolutely not the point. But there's a wealth of research and expertise at this stage, which, you know, demonstrates that deliberation can promote reflection. It can promote open-mindedness, listening, respect, and particularly the open-mindedness towards others, you know, which is really what gets us to kind of higher levels of understanding. Nicole Curata in Canberra has done some really interesting research, which shows that even in times of crisis in the Philippines, where solidarity is privileged and disagreement very much discouraged, that it can serve an important role in fostering a sort of an inclusive discourse. The other important thing, I think, when we think about the kind of the problematic role almost of expertise in eroding the legitimacy of democracies, is that many publics, because they separate the experts from the vested interests from the civil society, people's different interests, the question of qui bono, who benefits from this, becomes clear. So if we have a climate assembly, it's very clear the difference between a climate scientist and an economist in the pay of the Farmers Association, or an economist in the pay of the oil and gas industry. So the latter two become vested interests. And this kind of division, I think, helps and aids the information environment overall. So I think that's one of the reasons why the activist group XR, for example, have been calling for climate assemblies, because from their point of view, this kind of inclusion of the public in these deliberative assemblies enables a longer term look at the climate disaster facing all of us, which politicians with their necessarily short time horizons just can't match. So the public who are worried about their children and their grandchildren are worried about unborn generations. They can act and make longer term recommendations than can politicians with their much shorter term time horizon. And indeed, just a very quick anecdotal example, in Ireland, Ireland was the first country to institute a climate citizens assembly. We were the climate laggard of Europe. You know, huge agricultural interests, huge transport interests. And we all thought, well, as a small country, we could let others do the running and just come in behind. And that climate assembly voted for very serious action for carbon taxes. It allowed the Parliament then to look at what the people wanted, and the Parliament then declared a climate emergency. So afterwards, we saw Macron, France, instituted a climate assembly following the Gilets jaunes protests. The conference, as I said, is doing it. Paris at the moment is setting up a citizen assembly to look at the issues. Berlin, I understand, is looking at it as well. So I think that in conclusion, we have to think that there is some evidence that these can work. But I think we'd just leave with the words of Habermas, who argues that when we're thinking about issues of public policy concern, and we're looking at moral and political judgments, as well as domain expertise, we need to have avenues for deliberation and the scrutiny of that expertise. So we need to think about enhancing democracy with that expertise. Thank you.